AITA for reminding my ex I'm only responsible for our children and not all of his kids. My ex-husband, 40 male and I, 35 female, have 2 sons together, ages 12 and 11. We divorced about a decade ago, and it wasn't an easy decision. I never imagined we'd end up like this, especially with the bond we once shared. But, honestly, things started going south during my second pregnancy. When I found out I was pregnant with our youngest, I was so hopeful it would bring us closer. I envisioned us growing into a real family unit, with him stepping up as a supportive partner and father. But instead, it seemed like he decided to regress and relive his teenage years or his 20s. Instead of taking on more responsibility, he leaned into his friends and social life, like he was some carefree bachelor without a family waiting for him at home. I remember nights when he'd be out until late, leaving me at home with our toddler and a growing belly. He'd go out drinking, having fun, spending time with his friends. And it wasn't just the social aspect that hurt. His friends seemed to view me as a sort of caretaker for him. I remember on more than one occasion, his friends calling me up to come pick him up from their place because they had to get on with things and didn't want him there anymore. They treated me more like his mom or his personal Uber than his wife. It was exhausting, and I felt completely alone. There I was, raising our son, pregnant with another, and dealing with his adventures. Any time I tried to confront him, he'd brush it off, tell me I was overreacting, or claim he'd do better. But things only worsened when our younger son was born. Rather than embracing fatherhood, he seemed even more determined to live like a young, carefree guy with no strings attached. Eventually, I hit a breaking point and realized that this was no way to live. I wanted a stable, supportive partner, not a man who felt more like a third child. So, I filed for divorce. Unsurprisingly, he fought hard for 50% custody of the kids, though at the time, I couldn't understand why he wanted it so badly. I wasn't sure he was ready to take on that level of responsibility, and I honestly think it was more about his pride than anything else. Thankfully, the court saw what I saw, and he was granted every other weekend and a couple of weeks during the summer, with alternating holidays. This seemed fair, especially since he was still in his friend's first, family later phase. For the first couple of years post-divorce, we stuck to that arrangement. He was still living his single life, coming and going as he pleased, and our interactions were limited. It wasn't ideal, but it worked, and I was just focused on giving our boys the stability they needed. During that time, I worked hard to create a safe, stable environment for them. I took on the daily responsibilities, made sure they had a routine, and tried to give them as much consistency as possible. Then, out of the blue, he started showing more interest in the kids. Suddenly, he was trying harder, picking them up from school, calling more often, showing up at their activities. At first, I was cautiously optimistic. Maybe he was finally starting to grow up and realize what he'd missed. It was around this time that I found out he'd gotten another woman pregnant. And for some reason, this new responsibility seemed to light a fire under him. I guess with 3 kids, he realized he couldn't afford to keep living like a college student. What shocked me the most was that he actually stepped up for that child, eventually gaining full custody. I won't lie, I was surprised and even impressed to some degree. He was finally embracing fatherhood, and I felt a little less resentment, thinking maybe he'd finally matured. Things between us improved, we could communicate better, and he seemed to have found some stability. A few years later, he met his current wife, and they had 2 more children together. So now, between our 2 sons, his 3rd child, and their 2 together, he had 5 kids. But it didn't stop there. His wife has 2 children from a previous relationship, whom she helps support even though they don't live with them. From what I understand, she's very involved in their lives financially and emotionally. It's a complicated web, and at this point, their household has a mix of full-time and part-time kids with a wide variety of needs. For a while, everything seemed fine between us. I kept my distance from his new family, focusing on our 2 sons. I wanted them to feel as comfortable and secure as possible. And at first, he didn't push. He was happy to co-parent our boys without dragging his new life into our dynamic. I thought we'd found a workable balance. But that all changed when his marriage started to hit a rough patch. It was subtle at first, little changes in his behavior and demeanor. He'd make offhand comments about how hard things are with 5 kids or mention that his wife was having a tough time. I didn't pry, honestly. It wasn't my business, but I noticed the shift. Slowly but surely, he started bringing his other children along during custody exchanges. Then it escalated. He'd casually ask if I could watch his other kids for a while or if I could take all of them out for an activity. I declined each time, politely, explaining that I wasn't comfortable with it. But he'd shrug it off, acting like it wasn't a big deal and saying we were one big family now, so I should get to know them. Then came the comments about clothes and items. He'd make remarks about the boys' old clothes, suggesting I send them over to his house for all the kids to share. He'd say, we need to make sure they all have what they need. I told him very firmly that I was only responsible for our 2 sons, not his other children. Each time, he'd give me this look, a mixture of frustration and disappointment, and say, but we're co-parents. It's our responsibility. The real breaking point came during back-to-school season. As usual, I bought the necessary supplies for our boys' backpacks, notebooks, pencils, all the basics. But when he saw what I'd bought, he had the audacity to tell me I hadn't bought nearly enough for everyone. I asked what he meant, genuinely confused, and he said there was no way I'd bought enough to share evenly among all 5 kids. I was stunned. I told him straight up, we don't have 5 kids. We have 2. He looked at me as if I were heartless, like I was somehow a monster for not supporting his entire household. I explained that I'm responsible for our children, not his other kids. That's when he launched into a speech about community, saying we should raise the kids together and that my approach was cold and distant. He even had the nerve to say it's impossible to just take care of 2 of them when all 5 kids live together 50% of the time. I reminded him he has a wife, and they are responsible for those children, while my financial responsibility only extends to our 2 sons. He looked at me, genuinely frustrated, and said, how can you be so cold? Those kids are your kid siblings. Don't you think they deserve support, too? I told him, firmly but calmly, that while I understand they're my son's siblings, they aren't my responsibility, and my focus is solely on our 2 boys. He shook his head and walked away, muttering about how selfish I was. Now, I'm left wondering if I'm being unreasonable. Am I cold-hearted for drawing this boundary? Should I be helping more, considering that all 5 kids are part of my son's lives? Or is it fair to expect him and his wife to handle their own household? I can't help but feel guilty, but at the same time, I don't think it's right for him to expect me to pick up the slack. AITA, Update 1. A few weeks after our last argument, when I thought my ex had finally understood that my financial responsibility extended only to our 2 sons, he decided to call me up out of the blue. It was late October, and the chill of autumn was setting in. I figured he'd be talking about some fall festival or maybe Thanksgiving plans. But no, he launched into what he called his great idea. Right away, I could tell from his tone that he was excited about it, like he was about to pitch some business venture, not discuss our children. And the more he talked, the more I felt this growing sense of dread about where he was going with it. He started by reminding me how important it is for our kids to have a sense of togetherness with their siblings. According to him, since they're all spending time under the same roof at his house, it's important that they feel like a unit. Then he pivoted, suggesting that the best way to make them feel connected would be to spend more time together as one big family. He proposed that we take all 5 kids out shopping, together, for new winter clothes. Apparently, this was his brilliant plan for fostering a sense of community and bonding among them. And, of course, he said we should share the responsibility of outfitting all 5 of them. At that point, I was trying to keep my cool and stay polite, even though my frustration was bubbling up fast. I explained that I had already bought clothes for our boys. They had new jackets, sweaters, and boots. I'd budgeted carefully for this, anticipating the change in weather, and made sure that my sons were fully prepared for winter. I didn't mention how I'd started shopping early, knowing the season was coming and trying to avoid the higher prices that always hit right as the temperatures drop. I'd put in the work to make sure our sons were set, and that was that. But my ex wouldn't let it go. He started telling me that I was being self-centered by only focusing on our 2 boys, that I needed to think about the other kids too. He went on and on about how, as a mother, I should naturally want to make sure all the kids had what they needed. He was speaking in this condescending tone, almost as if he thought he was delivering a life lesson. I felt my blood pressure rise as he kept insisting that I should be thinking about the big picture and how important it was for the kids to see that we're all in this together. He continued to hammer away, each word dripping with calculated guilt. He spun this image of my boys returning to his house in their brand new, cozy jackets, shoes with firm soles that would keep their feet warm through the biting cold, while their siblings looked on, shivering in thin, worn-out sweaters and last year's shoes with holes threatening to open up at the seams. He painted this picture of my sons parading around, flaunting their warm clothes while their siblings looked on, envious and vulnerable against the winter chill. According to him, this so-called disparity would wreak havoc on their young, tender hearts, scarring them with the knowledge that I refused to pitch in. He said it would create an uncomfortable tension, making my sons feel guilty for having what they needed while the other kids were left to make do with less. The more he talked, the clearer it became that he was trying to shift the blame entirely onto me. I could feel a bitter laugh building up inside me at the irony of it all. Here he was, lecturing me about how, as a mother, I should understand the importance of warmth, comfort, and equality, yet he didn't seem to realize that these were his children, his responsibility, not mine. His words reeked of entitlement, his tone patronizing, as if I were the negligent one who'd abandoned these poor, shivering kids. He was so quick to push his parental duty onto me, acting as if these other children were somehow my fault, as if their unmet needs were a moral failing on my part. The audacity was stunning, almost laughable. How could he possibly twist this around to make me the villain for setting boundaries and caring solely for our boys? But he wasn't done. Just when I thought he'd said it all, he took his pitch to another level. He leaned in with what he clearly thought was a foolproof plan, his solution to this fabricated problem. His voice took on a rehearsed quality, like he'd practiced it a few times in his head, and he launched into this grand scheme with the confidence of someone who thought they'd just solved world hunger. He suggested that, instead of both of us taking separate responsibility, we should pool our finances into one joint clothing budget. He spoke as if this was some great, selfless gesture, a show of unity for the kids. He went on, explaining that we'd split the costs evenly to ensure that all 5 children had what they needed, oblivious to the fact that only 2 of them were mine. Then, with the tone of someone delivering a brilliant punchline, he revealed his fair solution. Since I had more financial stability, a phrase he delivered with a smug certainty that made my skin crawl, he proposed that I cover 60% of this clothing budget, while he would, generously, cover the remaining 40%. He said it as if he were offering me a privilege, as though I'd be lucky to take on this extra burden because I was in a better position financially. My jaw nearly hit the floor. In what universe did he think I would willingly, happily fork over the majority of the funds to clothe his other kids he had after our divorce? It was almost like he thought he was doing me a favor, allowing me the opportunity to give back by taking on his household's expenses. The audacity! He really expected me to not only share the cost of clothing for all 5 kids but to cover more than half of it. And the way he justified it made my stomach turn. According to him, since I had a good job and was doing fine, I should understand that it's only fair for me to help out a little more. He kept saying, "You're a mom, you know what it's like. You should want to contribute more for the sake of all the kids," as if my financial success somehow obligated me to provide for the children he had with other women. It was like he thought I'd be flattered by his request to play mother to his other kids. The entitlement was staggering. He just assumed I'd roll over and start writing checks for his household. I couldn't believe he was actually expecting me to bail him out because he and his wife were struggling. It was like he had completely forgotten that these other children had nothing to do with me, and their needs weren't my responsibility. The whole situation felt surreal, like he was testing how far he could push me, how much he could get away with. He even had the nerve to imply that it was somehow my fault that I'd already bought clothes for our sons, like I had jumped the gun by taking care of their needs before he had his epiphany about a joint budget. He seemed to think that if I hadn't gone ahead and bought clothes for our kids, his plan would have been perfect. He actually made it sound like I'd created a problem by being responsible for our sons in advance, instead of waiting around to coordinate with him. I couldn't take it anymore. There was no point in trying to reason with him, no way he was going to see my side. He'd already decided that I was some kind of selfish villain, and he was intent on making me feel like I was abandoning all 5 kids by refusing to comply with his ridiculous plan. I felt my patience snap. Without another word, I simply hung up the phone. It took me a while to calm down after that. I couldn't shake the frustration, the disbelief, the sheer entitlement he'd shown. He clearly thought that by guilting me, by positioning himself as this struggling father trying to hold it all together, he could get me to step in and solve his problems. I could see the game he was playing, and the fact that he was using our children, our boys, as pawns to get what he wanted was infuriating. I am trying to do what's best for our children, while he seems determined to make me feel guilty for not doing more for his other kids. It's exhausting and frustrating, but I'm sticking to my boundaries, because at the end of the day, my focus is, and will always be, on the 2 children we share. And no amount of guilt tripping or manipulation is going to change that. Update 2. A few days after my ex's attempt to convince me to contribute to a joint budget for winter clothes for all 5 of his kids, he called me again. I saw his name flash on my phone screen, and my stomach immediately twisted. I could feel my irritation bubbling up just at the sight of it. After our last conversation, I had zero desire to deal with whatever he was going to throw at me this time. I knew him well enough to realize he wasn't calling to just catch up. Still, some part of me, maybe a lingering sense of politeness or curiosity, pushed me to answer the call. When I picked up, he surprised me by speaking casually, as if we hadn't just had a tense argument about sharing financial responsibility for his household. He didn't bring up our last conversation or even hint at the fact that I'd hung up on him in frustration. Instead, he launched into small talk, asking how I was doing, like he hadn't just tried to guilt-trip me into footing a 60% share of the winter clothes budget for 5 children. I answered him, though I kept my tone neutral, cautious, because I knew better than to think he was calling just to chat. I could sense that he was gearing up for something, I just didn't know what yet. After a few minutes of this awkward small talk, I decided to cut through the pretense. I asked him directly what he wanted, knowing that he was leading up to something. And that's when he dropped his latest bombshell. He started talking about how his other child's birthday was coming up soon. I sat there, silent and confused. I didn't know where he was going with this or why he thought I needed to know about it. In my confusion, I said a polite congratulations, trying to hide my growing annoyance. But he kept going. He told me he was looking forward to seeing me there, as if I'd automatically be attending. At this point, I was completely bewildered. I hadn't been invited, and even if I had, why would I go? His other children's birthdays weren't my business, and I hadn't been involved in their lives outside of a few run-ins here and there. Still, I held my tongue, hoping he'd explain what exactly he meant. And then, he dropped the real shocker. Casually, as if he were discussing the weather, he said he'd be expecting me to bring a generous gift for his child's birthday. And by generous, he meant a gift worth $1,000 or $2,000. For a moment, I thought I must have misheard him. My mind struggled to process the sheer absurdity of his request. My jaw actually dropped, frozen in shock. It felt like the world had slowed down as I replayed his words in my head. Here was a man who, only days before, had been demanding that I cover most of his household's winter clothing costs, and now, he had the audacity to expect me to fork over thousands of dollars for a child who wasn't even mine. The entitlement radiating from his tone was mind-boggling. He sounded so calm, so sure, as if asking me to fund his other child's birthday was the most normal, reasonable request in the world. In that moment, I realized he had genuinely convinced himself that I would just fall into line with his absurd demands, as if I were a permanent fixture in his financial support system. My thoughts raced, tumbling over each other in disbelief. Did he seriously expect me to hand over thousands of dollars? For a child I barely knew, a child he'd had with another woman, long after our marriage ended, it felt like some kind of elaborate prank. A twisted social experiment to see how far he could push me before I snapped. But the madness didn't stop there. Almost as if he'd rehearsed this speech, he added, with an air of smug satisfaction, that his other child's birthday was coming up next month, and for that occasion, he expected yet another $1,000 or $2,000 from me. He spoke with this strange confidence, As if he'd done me a favor by giving me a heads up, as if I should be grateful for the advance notice so I could budget accordingly. It was as though he saw himself as some kind of benefactor, generously informing me of these obligations he'd simply decided were mine to fulfill. In his mind, I should be thanking him for the privilege of throwing my hard-earned money at his responsibilities. The sheer audacity was almost too much to believe. It was too much. I couldn't believe the gall he had to call me up, just days after trying to guilt me into a joint budget for winter clothes, now asking me to hand over thousands of dollars as birthday gifts. In that moment, something snapped in me, and I couldn't help but laugh. It wasn't a small chuckle, either. It was the kind of laugh that builds up and explodes, fueled by pure disbelief and frustration. I laughed because it was absurd. I laughed because it felt like some kind of bizarre prank. I laughed because the entitlement and sheer audacity were so ridiculous that I couldn't respond any other way. He didn't take it well. He got quiet, obviously not expecting that reaction, and asked me why I was laughing, sounding genuinely confused and maybe even a little hurt. But I couldn't stop. The absurdity of it all was overwhelming, and all I could think was, this man is out of his mind. He truly expected me to treat his other kids as my financial responsibility, like I was some kind of ATM he could draw from whenever he was in a bind. And he thought that I, of all people, would simply fall in line with his plans. When I finally managed to regain my composure, I told him exactly what I thought. I told him that his demands were ridiculous and that it was laughable that he would expect me to pay thousands of dollars for birthdays that had nothing to do with me. I told him that he was acting like a clown, and it was high time he learned to take care of his own family without clinging to me. I told him that his children, beyond our 2 sons, were not my problem, and that he needed to stop trying to drag me into his mess. After that, I hung up. I didn't wait for him to respond or argue, because I knew he tried to twist it, tried to guilt me, tried to make me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. But I wasn't going to let him manipulate me anymore. I was done being his safety net, his fallback option, whenever he was in over his head. I had my own responsibilities, and I had already made it abundantly clear that my priority was our 2 sons, not the family he had created after we divorced. Maybe one day, he'll realize that I'm not his backup plan, not his financial crutch, not the answer to his problems. Until then, I'm focusing on what truly matters, providing for and raising my sons, without letting his endless demands weigh me down.